12th of March 1943, Vitiaz Strait, Bismarck Sea, Japanese pilots mocked the US B-25 Mitchell Boxy Slow, a medium that missed from safe altitudes. Ordinary, they said. Predictable. Then the horizon belched smoke. Mitchells dropped to wave top 50s, flensing gun crews bombs, skipping like flat stones into steel. In minutes, transports burned, destroyers reeled, and the laughter died in the engine roar. Mockery, they learned, is not armor. It is a fatal range error paid for in ships and men. Early in the Pacific War, imperial planners trusted altitude formation discipline and the clean geometry of escort. Convoys would sprint beneath layered flak while Zero fighters shredded anything that dared to descend. Doctrine prized elegance, tight columns, precise timing, practiced intercept arcs. Gunners drilled upward sweeps through uncluttered sky. From Rabaul, plotting rooms to lay timetables, the math felt unbreakable. Speed plus weather plus escort equaled safe arrival. American machines seemed to validate the thesis. The B-25's glass nose signaled old habits, its silhouette a fat target for disciplined fire. Mediums stayed high, CEPs sprawled across acres of ocean, and the sea forgave their misses. Confidence hardened into culture-quality aircraft, veteran crews, and refined gunnery would outclass any ordinary Mitchell. What the calculus never modeled was a doctrinal pivot hidden below the flak umbrella field. Modified B-25s bristling with forward 50s, trained to fly at mast height. Suppress the deck's first blind directors, stun gunners, rattle helmsmen out of station, then deliver delayed fuse bombs that skipped off the skin of the sea and punched into plates. Geometry that works at 10,000 feet collapses at 60. Sightlines vanish in spray. Timing fractures. Columns kink. The Axis faith in altitude and finesse met a low-slung, brutal physics lesson, one that would turn routes on the map into killing lanes overnight. To Axisize the B-25 Mitchell broadcast mediocrity. It was neither a glamorous heavy nor a nimble attack plane. It sat in the doctrinal middle medium where, by pre-war logic, ships survived. Japanese aviators and gunnery officers measured threats by altitude and approach profile. Torpedo bombers at wave top with Type 91s deadly. Dive bombers with steep angle accuracy dangerous. Mediums droning in at 10,000 feet manageable. The Mitchell's glass nose and Norden sight advertised old habits, straight and level runs, long bomb lines, and circular errors that swallowed moving ships whole. If you kept your columns tight and your escorts alert, a B-25 would miss, then die tired. Their confidence was earned by early war evidence. High-altitude level bombing against maneuvering vessels had a reputation for theatrical splashes and few hits. A convoy's geometry worked in the defender's favor, layered flak firing upward through clear sightlines. Zeros free to rake the bomber stream, helmsmen weaving the whole formation out of pattern drops. In this arithmetic, the B-25 looked like a fat, predictable target, twin engines, modest speed, broad planform, something a veteran gun crew could bracket and a disciplined fighter element could peel apart. There was also a cultural bias toward engineering elegance. Imperial planners prized platforms that embodied precision, sleek airframes, clean dive profiles, refined torpedoes. Against that aesthetic, the Mitchell felt blunt. Its strengths, rugged structure, roomy bays, tolerance for abuse, read as civilian virtues, not combat edge. Even the airframe's adaptability worked against its reputation. A bomber that could carry almost anything suggested to critics a machine with no singular excellence. Finally, the Axis mental model assumed air combat resolved vertically. Threat vectors came from above or swooped from steep angles. Defenses were trained to look up and lead. Doctrine sights and muscle memory all pointed skyward. In that vertical war, the B-25 was a mediocre climber, a middling performer, an airplane that would arrive late, line up long, and bleed speed into the teeth of flak. If it persisted in the old script altitude elegance timing, it would continue to underperform against ships and continue to earn contempt. So they laughed not as amateurs, but as professionals who had seen this film before. They had not seen the next reel. The problem facing the Allies in New Guinea was not abstract. It moved on timetables and tonnage across a narrow throat of water between Rabaul and Lae. If Japan could reinforce Lae-Mengun's fuel, Port Moresby would remain under pressure, the Owen Stanley barrier would stay contested, and any Allied push up the New Guinea coast would grind against a replenished enemy. The Imperial staff believed distance, weather, and escort could muscle convoys through the Vitiaz's Strait faster than Allied air could break them. On maps, the Arrow reached the beach on schedule. 5th Air Force had to shatter that schedule with tools it actually possessed. Land-based torpedo bombers were scarce. Navy carriers were elsewhere. Terrain and weather butchered neat plans. Airfields were muddy maintenance improvised, and radar coverage imperfect. Fighters like the P-38 could stretch to cover, but the decisive lever had to be weight-delivered reliably, day after day, from the fields around Port Moresby and Milne Bay. That meant mediums and light attack aircraft, the very category Axis doctrine dismissed. At medium altitude, results against ships remained an accountant's embarrassment. Bomb patterns looked beautiful on briefing boards and useless over whitecaps. Every time a convoy jinked, a meticulously plotted drop became a geometry lesson in failure. The Allies needed a method that translated air effort into flooded compartments, not claims. They needed to turn the sea's surface from a forgiving mirror into a fuse. Enter X, the Mitchell reimagined as a mast-height. Ship-killer forward-firing 50s to strip-decks delayed fuse bombs thrown like skipping stones, and an attack profile that lived in the convoy's blind cone. This was not an accessory to high-altitude doctrine, it was a replacement for it. The B-25's ordinariness became an asset the airframe could absorb field mods. Crews could be trained quickly. Logistics could feed a weapon you could build and repair in theater. Under George Kenney's ruthlessly practical command, and Paul Pappy Gunn's barn-level genius workshops turned into war labs. Glass noses sprouted gun forests, cheek blisters and package mounts thickened the forward punch. Wiring looms and blast tubes were hacked, tested, and safety wired by men who measured success in scorched paint and tighter groups. But X was more than hardware. It was choreography. Heavy B-17s at altitude would open the dance not to sink ships outright, but to tear formation discipline, forced turns, broken columns helmsmen off their marks. RAAF Beaufighters would rake beam on to pin gunners to shields and blind directors. Then the Michels and A-20s would arrive in the troughs 230 knots, 60 to 150 feet, firing first to kill the eyes and hands of defense, releasing at seconds, not miles, fuses set to wait just long enough for steel to swallow steel. It was combined arms translated into seconds and spray. Strategically, the promise was brutal clarity. If a convoy could not keep station, and it could not be protected. If decks were blinded, guns could not range. If bombs detonated inside, damage control became prayer. Operationally, the B-25 solution scaled. You could hang more guns tomorrow, train another crew next week, and repeat the profile until the enemy changed behavior or stopped sailing. That was the untold problem. The Axis did not model Allied constraints, forced invention, and invention reached under their doctrine. The sea lane to lay wasn't a line to be guarded from above, it was a corridor to be mined with physics from the side. The B-25 Mitchell mocked, as ordinary became the instrument of that physics. And when the convoy lifted in late February, the solution was already idling on Moresby's hardstands oil-warm fuses, set guns loaded for a lesson in altitude's limits. They called it a laboratory, but it looked like a shed that had swallowed a thunderstorm. Corrugated walls sweating in the New Guinea heat, concrete stained with fuel, a jungle of trestles and tool carts, barrels of solvent, crates of 50 caliber links stacked like dull brass bricks. The airframe in the Center 1 B-25, dragged in by hand, tugs paint, still tacky from a hasty respray, was open like a patient nose, panels off, belly doors gaped, wiring looms unbraided and chalk-marked. Men in grease-blackened khaki argued by pointing at metal. Paul Pappy Gunn did not look like an engineer out of a brochure. He moved like a flight line chief with a clock in his head and a fire under his boots. He palmed a stub of chalk, drew rectangles and sightlines on the aluminum, then wiped them away with the side of his hand when the angle offended him. He didn't write memos. He built statements. This nose, he said, does not need a bombardier's cathedral of glass. It needs teeth. The first teeth were Browning 50s crammed into spaces the original draftsman never imagined. 2 in the nose, then 4, then 8 staggered to feed from trays a crew chief could reload with his eyes closed. Cheek blisters grew from the fuselage like purposeful tumors, each with another pair of guns and sight rails to take the weight. Package mounts, boxy riveted fairings bolted to the sides like armor, each hiding more barrels, everything forward, everything pointing straight down the throat of a ship at wavetop. The bombardier's stool became a gunner's perch. The Norden sight gave way to a ring, a reflex, and a pilot's knuckles. When the drawings refused to cooperate, hacksaws spoke. Sheet metal came off in crescents. Hard points were drilled and backed with doublers until the skin no longer shivered. Blast tubes ran forward so muzzle wash wouldn't peel the nose like fruit. Ammunition feeds were tested by hand cranks until belts flowed like water and jammed like sin, no more than you'd expect in combat. Safety wire glittered everywhere. A young corporal counted trigger pulls into a log until the pencil point snapped and another one took its place. Outside, the weather taught its own lessons. In the hour between squalls, they flew test hops over the water and shot at nothing, just to feel the airframe change with the weight. The Mitchell pitched less than you'd fear, yawed more than you'd like, and answered best when you didn't baby it. The pilots learned to point the whole machine like a finger. On the return, someone always slid under to check for oil weeps and loose fasteners. After the first day of sustained firing, the paint behind the muzzle ports had burned into a leopard's mask. On the second, they added small shields. On the third, they learned to live with scorched paint. The bombs came next. Not new bombs, there wasn't time for new, but new ways to throw old steel. Skip bombing is the kind of idea children discover with stones and ponds. War only changed the scale and the consequences. The crews practiced with concrete dummies and live tails set with delays long enough to let the casing bite metal before the heart went off. Approach low-ride the troughs, hold fire until the deck grew faces. Smash those faces, release when the bow filled the windscreen with its wrongness, then fly through your own spray. They built this progression into a catechism: suppress, skip, survive. It was choreography as much as mechanics. Gunn's shed was in conversation with Kenny's ops room, and both were listening to the ocean's grammar. Heavy B-17s at height would turn neat columns into ragged lines. Beaufighters would come beam on with their own cannon and rake. Then the Mitchells, these new toothy things, would arrive as if the sea itself had thrown them up. At mast height, the convoy's world went blind, directors lost range, gunners flinched into their shields. Helmsmen twitched the column apart, little inputs with huge costs. That was the breach the bomb would enter, bouncing once, twice, and vanishing under the sheer slab of a transport's side. Problems surfaced and were hammered down. Triggers linked to give the pilot a single fistful of fire. Sight picture standardized so a man who'd flown a mail route last year could learn to kill a ship this week. Fuel management tweaked so the engines wouldn't cough when the nose dropped, and the negative G tried to tear the world backward. Delays adjusted so explosions didn't kick water into the tail. Every solved problem bought seconds, and seconds were where ships lived or died. Word spread the way useful rumors do. A new Mitchell had teeth. You could hear it before you saw it. An ugly, complex, beautiful sound like a zipper on the sky. Crews from units that had never expected to fly this low wandered through the shed and touched the gun jackets with 2 fingers, the way men touch relics. They went back to their tents and talked in small, excited voices about angles and speeds, and how the sea looked different at 60 feet, like it was trying to grab you by the ankles. Fear and appetite grew together. There was no christening, no ribbon. One morning, the modified Mitchells simply rolled one by one past the revetments and out toward a runway that steamed like a living thing. They took off heavy and leveled at heights that made tower operators swear. The ocean received them without comment. A few miles out, they formed like punctuation marks, commas, semicolons, between the long flat clauses of cloud and sea. And in the shed that had been a laboratory, the remaining men set their watches and went back to work on the next airframe, because once an idea proves it can live, the only favor you owe it is multiplication. By the time the last nose was buttoned up that week, the impossible idea had grown ordinary. A medium bomber with a mouthful of guns, a pilot who thought in seconds instead of miles, and a bomb that wanted to behave like a skipping stone before it remembered it was a heart of explosive. That ordinariness was the point. If you could do it once, you could do it 100 times. And the sea, faithless to geometry, generous to brutality, was waiting. The cleverness wasn't mystical. It was layered physics and ruthless sequencing, applied where the enemy least expected it, inside the convoy's eyesight, below its instruments, beneath its doctrine. The secret sauce had 4 ingredients: suppression, timing, geometry, and scale, and the Mitchell, newly wired and newly mean, carried them all. Suppression comes first because nothing else happens if the ship keeps its eyes. In the old altitude war, the bomber's bomb was the first persuasive act. Everything before it was prelude. At mast height, the order inverted. The Mitchell's forward battery, 8 guns in the nose, more in cheeks and packages, wasn't ornamental. It was a frontal lobotomy administered at 230 knots. The first 1-second burst didn't try to kill steel, it tried to kill seeing. Optics directors' flesh, the mess that makes a gun find lead angles, had to go away. Only then did the bomb matter. Crews learned the sound and feel of enough, the thudding rise in engine note, As the airplane unburdened itself of fear, the way return fire sagged in the corner of the windscreen when the deck teams were on the floor. Doctrine, if something so hard-won can be called doctrine, condensed into a sentence, make them blind, then make them leak. Timing sat inside everything like a fuse. Against a maneuvering ship, range is elastic and angles lie. Seconds tell the truth. The run-in had beats, initial align guns, micro-corrections, release, fly-through. Each beat had hazards. Align too early and you give gunners a clean look. Align too late and you'll skip into the bow wave. Fire too soon and you chew water. Fire too late and their fire chews you. Release too high and the bomb behaves like a sulky stone. Too low and it smashes itself flat. Good crews wrote timing into muscle. Great crews wrote it into conversation, the pilot counting in clipped syllables, the navigator calling drift like a drum major, the top gunner seeing the whole thing from a half-second in the future and shouting the difference. Geometry was the honest enemy. At 10,000 feet, it's a trigonometry problem. At 60, it's a bar fight. Spray hides, wakes lie ships, jink in short, stupid pulses that mean everything, and the ocean itself reaches up to claw lift away. The Mitchell's secret wasn't that it defied geometry, it weaponized it. Approach slightly off the bow to make the helmsman commit. Let his correction open a lane. Accept the fact that level isn't level when the troughs are steep. Hold your horizon to keep the bomb skipping forward, not sideways. Don't chase the stern once you've decided it will always look bigger and closer than it is. The best pilots described it later in poor words and rich hands, showing with their fingers how the ship's head fake created the very path that killed it. Then there was scale, the ingredient that turned tactics into strategy. One brilliant low-level strike can hurt a convoy. Dozens repeated can erase a shipping plan from a theater. The Mitchell's airframe welcomed scale because it asked reasonable things of logistics. 50 cal ammunition stacked well, traveled well, and behaved in mud. The mounts were bolts and brackets, not miracles. Delayed fuses could be set by men with pliers and standards cards. Engines could be kept alive by spares conjured from crates and cleverness. Training was a syllabus that fit on a board, profiles drawn in chalk, a handful of altitudes, and indicated airspeeds, a discipline of not overthinking the seconds that mattered. If you can teach it fast, you can multiply it. And if you can multiply it, even the enemy's good days drown. All of this worked because it wasn't alone. The sauce spilled across a table set by others. B-17's boring to the unromantic did the unromantic work of tearing formations with pattern bombs, misses that mattered because they made columns kink and spacing lie. Beaufighters struck beam on, forcing heads down and mouths open. A-20s added their own light attack teeth where the line thinned. Fighter cover kept the Zeros busy, drawing the sting from the one part of the sky the Mitchell couldn't afford to police while it was watching the waves. If you watched from above with a god's impatience, you might have called it chaos. If you watched from a ship's bridge, you called it drowning in slices. The enemy had counters on paper. More escorts, heavier flak concentration, smoke, night movement, hugging coasts where geography might smother approach lanes. But paper is kind. In practice, more escorts just meant more ships to blind and bleed. Heavier flak mattered until guns lost their eyes. Smoke helped until the wind decided it loved you less. Night promised relief until radials and moonwater taught different lessons, and even then the day always came back. Hugging coasts put you where rocks and reefs waited for a helmsman's mistake, an error measured in inches charged in lives. There were hidden advantages too, the ones historians often bury under tonnage tables. Psychology for one. Convoy men are not cowards. They have to be braver than most because the sea is patient. But bravery is specific. It lives in routines that make fear small. Mast-height assault murdered routine. Gunners who expected arcs and lead suddenly faced muzzle flashes at eyeline. Helmsmen who trusted station felt their fingers become clumsy. Officers who dealt in minutes were forced to spend seconds. This is not abstraction, it's error, and error in an iron world is evaporation. The Mitchell's own vices were part of its virtue. It was not a delicate airplane. It welcomed rough fields and bad weather with a plodding, honest grace. In the skip-bombing role, this meant crews could keep flying on days when a temperamental thoroughbred would sulk. It meant the guns and mounts took abuse without going sour. It meant you could come home with holes you didn't have at takeoff and still roll to a stop with some brakes and a prayer, and then in a shed that looked like a thunderstorm, men could put you back together with the same bolts and belts and wire they'd used the day before. Most secret sauces curdle when exported. This one traveled wickedly well. The profile that bled a transport near Leh could bleed a freighter somewhere else, or a barge line or any hub and spoke that assumed the ocean was friendly if you respected it. Respect does not purchase immunity. It buys you time, and time was exactly what the Mitchell came to steal. Every convoy that slowed to dress ranks for flak was an invitation. Every timetable that slid an hour to wait for weather was a confession. The Allied problem had been translation, turning sorties into consequences. The Mitchell's source translated fluently across dialects of sea and season. Strip away the romance and you are left with numbers that don't blink. Guns forward mean fewer living gunners on the other side of the equation. Delays set right mean more internal detonations and fewer pretty plumes. Profiles taught well mean crews that repeat under pressure. Factory lines running mean fresh airframes to replace the unlucky and extend the lucky. Add them and you get the only outcome. War respects behavior change. The enemy sails less, spreads thinner, or bleeds more. In New Guinea, they bled more until they sailed less. And that finally was the strategic superiority everyone felt, but few named in the moment: feedback speed. The Mitchell's method compressed the loop between idea test fielding and effect. A week in the shed could be a lesson on the sea, 10 days later a change in enemy routing a week after that. Short loops beat proud theories. Elegance died in contact with iteration. The rest is noise. Gunsmoke on a morning sea, brass tinkling in the fuselage belly, a pilot with his jaw set measuring a ship in heartbeats, a bomb that thinks it is a stone for two bright skips, then a thud you feel in your molars and a sheet of water that climbs to hide the proof. Call it secret sauce if you like, cooks need names. What matters is that it fed on the one resource the enemy could not spare: convoys, and it ate fast enough to starve a plan. 2nd of March 1943, late morning north of Cape Ward Hunt. The sea is a panelled grey ribbed with white, where wind fingers the troughs. From altitude, the Japanese convoy looks confident: 8 transports in box formation, 8 destroyers flexed as a moving fence, fighters prowling a ring of air above. That confidence is the point. Confidence invites a neat plan. Neat plans can be broken. The first Americans appear where doctrine expects them high. B-17s step down from cloud, like patient judges, contrails smudging into the ceiling, pattern bombs climbing off their racks and walking the water in beads of white. Hits are not the objective, deformation is. When helmsmen throw their wheels to dodge splashes, the columns kink and elastic slack appears between ships. The neat box becomes a wrinkled sheet. Every wrinkle is a lane. There is a pause, a thin, deceptive quiet, while columns try to re-knit. Then the second sound arrives, a rasping animal noise. Beaufighters in at beam on height, engines soaring, cannon thumping the water to get the range, then lifting to rake decks. Their job is not the kill. It is the grim work of making men small. Directors lose their horizontal, gunners hunch behind shields, and every officer on every bridge becomes preoccupied with survival instead of station. 20 seconds pass that way. 20 seconds is a currency. Out beyond the convoy's weeping perimeter, Mitchells form into teeth. Pilots drop to 60, 80, 100 feet, depending on what the sea offers, and set their throttles where noise becomes promise. The lead flight advances not as dots in the sky, but as flares on the horizon. Muzzle flashes seen before the airplanes that make them. The first burst will be cruelly short and exactly placed, intended to walk across the forward gun mounts of a selected ship. Tracers find the shield, the faces behind it, the optics that made those faces relevant. Everything happens in short sentences now. The lead, Mitchell, chooses an angle just off the bow to force the helmsman into a lie. He rides a trough, the nose dips and the horizon tilts. He corrects with a whisper of rudder, feels the airplane settle back into its own certainty. The navigator calls drift in clipped syllables. The top gunner barks a correction half a second early, because half a second late is history, not guidance. When the deck fills the windscreen, the pilot knows the range less by numbers than by the way fear narrows his world to a keyhole. He presses the triggers, the ship flinches as if struck with a fist. Somewhere in that flinch is a lane. Release is not ceremony, it is muscle. The bomb tumbles toward the sea, checks its pride against a hard surface, and if timing is right, becomes a skipping stone with malice. It touches once, twice, then slaps into the hull where paint peels in bright curls. The delayed fuse begins its private count. The pilot flies through his own spray, holds level by feel, while water claws his lift, then yanks a discreet climb and banks away, mind already severed from the bomb he let go. Seconds later, the ocean stands up in a column beside the transport, and the ship's deck seems to fold on an axis no one drew. Behind him, the second Mitchell commits to a destroyer that has turned too bravely toward the threat. That nearer target offers an easier sight picture but fiercer teeth. The pilot answers with more gun, longer burst, steadier hand, and releases a hair later to shorten the skip to make the bomb bite without skittering. The destroyer's bow disappears in a white smear, and when the water drains off her foredeck, is not where it used to be. She staggers, screws thundering helm, trying to write a straight sentence on a page that no longer exists. The convoy's fighter escort finally gets a clean look at the pattern. Zeroes knife down to claw at the runs. But they face a math problem with no elegant solution. To stop a mast-height attack, you must occupy the same thin slice of air as a machine that is spitting fire in a straight line at deck level. Beaufighters return to pin them, P-38s drop into the weave where they can, and the Mitchells keep their appointments with the waves. One chases a freighter lifting smoke from a previous hit and sees men jumping. He feels the moment bend in him, then places the sight a fraction forward of where his guilt wanted it, and does his job. Not every run is clean. One Mitchell chews water with his first burst and takes a laminar sheet of spray onto the windscreen. Blindness at 60 feet is a terror few words can hold. The co-pilot slaps the wiper. The pilot flies the attitude he trained into his hands. The sight picture returns like a friend who left the party early and came back out of pity. He releases late, but not wrong. The bomb takes only one skip, and its fuse was set with a number that seems blessed. A destroyer turns to make smoke for the wounded, and in her gallant pivot, she opens her flank. An A-20 shoulders into the gap, the smaller twin humming with delusions of grandeur. Its bombs are modest, its bravery is not. The hits are not mortal, but they are insulting. The destroyer's frame shivers, and her smoke loses its helpful discipline. Farther out, a transport that had been clever staying on the outer arc, patient dignity intact, takes a hit under the afterdeck and begins to burn as if insulted to death. From above, the B-17 crews watch the pattern they made become pathology. Where they forced turns, ships now collide with their own bad choices. Where they left lanes, Mitchells write in ink. Radios clog with fragments, orders are issued in tones that imply requests. Charts on bridge tables become more like prayer books opened and closed without reading. The sea collaborates. The swell builds just enough to hide approach wakes. Sunlight slants through broken cloud to burn out a gun director's delicate sight. In the trough of one wave, a Mitchell disappears from a destroyer's arc of fire, and when it rises out, the other side, it arrives carrying a decision the destroyer cannot argue with. There is a moment in every battle when the participants' expectations give up and walk away. For this convoy, it happens just after noon, when 3 hits occur inside a span of minutes. One transport takes 2 in quick succession, one forward, one amidships, and the plume from the second detonation seems to swallow the first. Another, tugging awake like a stubborn child, takes a bomb under the stern and lifts her screws clear, for a second screaming like metal remembers it is born of heat. The air changes. Even those who cannot see understand that the day's shape has been decided. The retreat is not ordered, it is enacted. Destroyers try to gather the surviving transports into a rump formation and shepherd them toward the theoretical safety of cloud or coastline. But shepherding assumes flocks that still heed crooks. These ships are stubborn with damage, their helmsmen drunk on shock, their build-up of small humiliations, now an armor against coherent obedience. The Mitchells exploit without malice. There is no time for malice at 60 feet. Another run, another burst, another skip, another white column that rises to erase the last doubt. By late afternoon, the battle is a scatter of burning nouns, a transport that was, a destroyer that might not be, a plane turning for home, with a wing you can see through if the sun is right. The radio net loses volume. Men husband their words the way they husband fuel. In the operations room far away, chalk marks are added to a board with a pride too tired to grin. The lesson is written in smoke, the idea lives. Realization did not arrive as an epigram. It arrived in the smell of hot paint and in the way a helmsman's hands shook when he reached for a cup he did not intend to drink from. It arrived when officers who had been educated in geometry stared at a sea that had refused to honor angles. It arrived most of all in the ears in the sound of a Mitchell's forward battery tearing the air into cloth and the unmistakable double slap of a bomb skipping toward a future the listener would not share. On the surviving bridges, men tried to speak the old language bearing speed station into radios that coughed back only weather and panic. A A destroyer captain, eyes salt-burned and watering from smoke, shouted for concentration of fire at mast height. His gunnery officer, still trained for the vertical war, lifted his eyes instinctively to the sky and had to drag them down like a disobedient thought. The first volley went high. The second found only spray. By the time the third was honest, the Mitchell's bursts had walked the length of the foredeck, and the officer was lying among casings that would never be reloaded. On a transport, the helmsman discovered that the ship's wheel had become a suggestion device. Every correction induced a larger reaction several seconds later. The wake writhed like the body does under bad news. He felt a vibration through the column, not rhythmic like a healthy machine, but jagged like a lie trying to pass itself off as a plan. The engine room reported temperatures in a language of understatement that meant fire. Above, men dragged hoses with the fatal optimism sailors reserve for water. Water that cools water, that drowns water, that hides defeat under a moving skin. Fighter pilots circling the bleeding formation found themselves attacking problems without elegant entrances. To kill a mast-height attacker, you must either be behind it when it is committed or in front of it before it decides to commit. The first required clairvoyance, the second prophecy. They dived and climbed and called to each other in clipped syllables that had never included this script. A few kills were claimed and were probably real. A few Mitchells went into the sea and did not come out. Those truths did not lift the weight. Too many other runs completed, too many other columns rose. The pilots understood that courage had not failed them, geometry had. Gunnery officers' men, who had spent years coaxing lead and lag into a species of truth, found their instruments unhelpful at eye level. Rangefinders fogged with spray. Directors screamed for calm that the body could not supply. The human brain loves parabolas at distance. At 60 feet, it loves flinching. Flinch and you miss. Don't flinch and you die. Many managed some unhappy composite of the two. In the convoy's shadowed corners, small acts of competence persisted. Damage control teams sealed doors in patterns learned in harbor and validated under hell. A petty officer traced steam in a passageway to a cracked flange and shut the valve with the dignity of a man closing his own front gate. A signalman flagged honest messages that could be read through smoke. A cook led men to a storeroom where life jackets were stowed and put them on strangers with the gentleness reserved for children and the dooming calm of a man who knows he is late. But competence cannot reverse physics. The delayed fuse device does not care about valor, it admires contact. When a bomb finds home inside steel, the detonation is refracted a private weather event. Bulkheads bow, seams complain, floors warp. The ship is a cathedral designed to carry weight. Suddenly its pillars sing wrong notes. Officers who knew their ship as a house know they are now standing in a ruin that pretends. Realization lives in that instant as a subtraction, things you can no longer ask the hull to do. Reports climbed the chain and found their way to charts. The neat arrows that had run from Rabaul to Lai wavered, then wandered, then broke. Planners who had treated the sea as a conveyor belt were forced to redraw it as an argument. Schedules became rumors. Escorts multiplied until the convoy resembled a hedgehog and then thinned again when fuel arithmetic wrote its own orders. Smoke was laid more aggressively. Sometimes it obscured enemy aim, more often it obscured the truth from the men who most needed to see it. Night promised mercy. Night delivered collisions and navigational sin. The next day returned like an invoice. After-action language became delicate in the way defeated prose learns to be. Severe interference by enemy air. Unexpected low-level attacks, losses disproportionate to past experience. Buried inside such phrases was a private confession shared by those who had watched the sea lift high beside them. We were not prepared to fight at this height, at this nearness, at this speed. The Mitchell was not a better high-altitude bomber. It was a different question. There were moments of naked admission. A captain told his surviving officers softly that future convoys would have to disperse and accept the arithmetic of exposure. A staff officer pencil hovering above a map allowed that the route to Lai was not a line to be defended, but a volume to be avoided. A pilot wrote in his log the sentence he could not write in his report. We were surprised from below. Among the crews who had laughed at the B-25, the realization was uglier because it was personal. Mockery is an investment. It pays a dividend called blindness. They recognized in retrospect how the airplane's ordinariness had functioned as camouflage for intent. No one expects genius in a shed. No one expects a medium bomber to arrive at the height of a man's fear and speak in the language of machine guns and skipping stones. Later in hospital wards and in barracks that smelled of disinfectant and denial, They repeated the neat phrases they could carry into sleep. But in some dreams the sea slapped twice, and the bomb vanished into a wall they could not see through, and they woke with the remembered taste of cordite and salt. The geography changed with the thinking. Routes bent wider to hug coasts that offered concealment and new hazards. Lift schedules were cut, then cut again. Some movements migrated to darkness and found that darkness had a price. A few operations were cancelled outright, the reports circling their decision with careful justifications that did not include the word fear. In the ledger that matters, the entries turned red. Tonnage not delivered is not abstract. It is hunger in a trench and empty crates on a beach, and orders that cannot be acted upon because the ammunition arrived as bubbles. In Tokyo and Rabaul, the sentences grew heavier. Men who had built careers on elegance spoke with new respect for brutality that worked. They talked of countermeasures as staffs must and meant them. But behind the lists was a knowledge that doctrine changes slowly and bombs count quickly. The Mitchell had taught not only a tactic, but a posture speed between idea and effect. That is a terrifying teacher to be forced to learn from in public. By the evening of 4th of March, smoke lay in horizontal bands over the Bismarck Sea, like the staff lines of a grim hymn. Survivors clung to rafts that shone intermittently in the hard sunlight, and the smell of burnt oil carried farther than any after-action phrase. Realization settled not as a single moment, but as a weather system. It had shape and pressure and the promise of recurrence. The men who had lived through it understood there would be no going back to a war of comfortable angles. The sea had been lowered to the height of a man's shoulders, and at that height, intimate, cruel, efficient America had found a way to win quickly. The Bismarck Sea did not merely sink ships, it reset the Pacific's logistics equation. Once mast-height Mitchells proved they could turn a convoy into wreckage in minutes, the Allied center of gravity shifted decisively to air denial of sea movement. Routes that had been straight lines on staff maps became hazardous volumes policed by low-level attack. Japanese reinforcement timetables to Leh, and then to every contested coast within Mitchell range, stretched, then frayed, then were cancelled. When convoys sailed, they sailed smaller at night, hugging coasts that added reefs, capes, and navigational sin to the enemy's risk ledger. Strategy followed physics. 5th Air Force replicated the choreography B-17s to deform Beaufighters to pin B-25s and A-20s to cut. The tactics scaled because the airframe and the syllabus were honest. You could teach it fast, maintain it in mud, and fly it often. Each week closed the loop between workshop and water, a new gun mount here, a fuse tweak there, a timing correction taught at breakfast and flown by lunch. Feedback speed, the quiet superpower of Allied industry and improvisation, became a weapon in itself. Operational outcomes stacked into strategic change. Starved garrisons fought shorter, interdicted build-ups never matured, Japanese staff planning, once elegant, grew defensive and costly. Air power married to practical engineering made the sea near New Guinea act like mined ground without mines. The wider front absorbed the lesson. Wherever the Allies could base mediums within a few hundred miles of a shipping lane, the calendar bent. Tonnage denied turned into initiative gained, and initiative converted through 1,000 low runs and 1,000 white plumes became ground-taken airfields seized and an enemy forced to retreat not only from places but from assumptions. In the calm vocabulary of post-war memoirs, the admissions are plain. A Japanese naval staff officer, summarizing convoy losses, wrote, "We prepared for attacks from above. We were defeated from below." The sentence is spare because defeat had already supplied the adjectives. German industry char Albert Speer, explaining a different theatre, yet the same arithmetic, put it colder still. We lost the war because we were outproduced. The Mitchell's story is a footnote to that verdict, a reminder that production mattered most when it fed ideas that multiplied quickly and punished slowly learned truths. Another Japanese survivor, asked what had changed after Bismarck Sea, said simply, "We stopped believing the ocean could protect us." Not poetry cartography. The map lost its safe colors. Every lane within range of a mast-height run became conditional, every schedule provisional, every promise to a frontline unit a gamble against seconds and spray. They mocked the B-25 Mitchell until convoys burned. Then they wrote careful sentences and shorter plans. The Allies did not win by elegance alone. They won by making brutality practical, repeatable, and fast. The sea, brought down to the height of a man's shoulders, became an Allied ally, and the war machine rolled.